Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sarah Siegel, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Véronique Tadjo, discussing her latest novel, In the Company of Men. She is joined in conversation tonight by Stéphane Robolin. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many questions as time allows. If you would like to buy a copy of In the Company of Men, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase it. All sales to this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your support of community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link to donate in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these past few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Véronique Tadjo is a writer, poet, novelist, and artist from Côte d'Ivoire. She earned a doctorate in Black American Literature and Civilization from the Sorbonne Paris 4 and went to the United States as a Fulbright Scholar at Howard University. She headed the French department of the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg until 2015. Her books have been translated into several languages, including The Blind Kingdom, The Shadow of Imana, Travels in the Heart of Rwanda, and Queen Pokou, Concerto for a Sacrifice, which was awarded the Grand Prix de Littérature d'Afrique Noire 2005. She is joined tonight by Stéphane Robolin. Stéphane is Associate Professor of English and the former Director of the Center for African Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. His research interests include African literature, African American literature, African diaspora studies, post-colonial literature and theory, and spatial theory. He's the author of Grounds of Engagement, Apartheid-Era African American and South African Writing, which was awarded the African Literature Association's first book award in scholarship. Robolin is currently working on a study that examines the underground movement of banned books in apartheid South Africa entitled Subterranean Circulations. Today they are discussing In the Company of Men. In a series of moving snapshots, Véronique Tadjo illustrates the terrible extent of the Ebola epidemic through the eyes of those affected in myriad ways. The doctor who treats patients in a sweltering tent, protected from the virus only by a plastic suit. The student who volunteers to work as a gravedigger while universities are closed. The grandmother who takes in a boy cast out of his village for fear of infection. And watching over them all is the ancient and wise baobab tree, mourning the dire state of the earth, yet providing a sense of hope for the future. Acutely relevant in our times in light of the coronavirus pandemic, In the Company of Men explores critical questions about how we cope with a global crisis and how we can combat fear and prejudice. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our speakers. Véronique, Stéphane, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Good evening to you, Véronique. I want to say what a pleasure and a deep personal privilege it is to be invited to join you today. I've long admired your work. I've had the joy of teaching your work numerous times in my courses, and I'm happy to say that this impressive book is going to be adopted for our course next term. And congratulations on the publication of the translation, which was just released yesterday. In the United States, but originally written in French in 2014.
No, 2017.
17. Sorry. Yes. No,
yes.
that would have been mid pandemic itself.
Yes,
so thanks for the correction. And as Sarah mentioned, and numerous commenters have observed, the translation is both an unfortunate and a fortunately timed release as we globally continue to struggle through a disastrous pandemic. I think obviously unfortunate because of the circumstances, but also fortunate in the sense that this book provides us with a book to think alongside the times, the current times that we live in, but also to return to an earlier moment, 2013 through 2016, when the Ebola virus hit the Mano River region that encompasses Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. So welcome. I'm just delighted to be with you, and looking forward to the conversation. Well, let me just start with the circumstances, how you arrived at this particular book. As with many of your books, you managed to produce a sweeping tale of somewhat mythical proportions, and at the same time, you achieve a real sense of intimacy. Right? You move us through a doctor, a nurse, a gravedigger, an orphan, but all the fine-grained detail of each of their perspectives really offers us not just intimacy, but really sort of a richer understanding of their perspectives and their experiences. Can you, how did you come to write the book? Can you talk to us about the genesis of the book? As an Ivorian, having grown up in West Africa, in neighboring Côte d'Ivoire, how did you understand your relationship to these countries and to the Ebola epidemic itself?
Yes, thank you, Stéphane. I was, as we said earlier, I was raised in Côte d'Ivoire, in West Africa. And so I spent most of my childhood, teenagehood, and even student days in Côte d'Ivoire before going abroad. So whatever happened what happened in West Africa was very worrying for me because it was a type of disease, the Ebola disease, that is very violent and creates a lot of suffering. And it just happens that it was very, it was mediatically covered intensively. And that created a kind of huge trauma. And also the fact that at the time I was living in South Africa, I was more and more concerned by what was happening in my home country. Côte d'Ivoire shares borders with Guinea in the north, and on the west side with Liberia. Therefore, everybody was kind of expecting that the epidemic would spread to Côte d'Ivoire. And it was a very, very tense time. Each time I visited, there was a lot of health restrictions. Everybody was on high alert. People, of course, were washing their hands all the time. And it was the first time that I experienced it, this kind of fear of catching a disease. Nobody was shaking hands anymore. People were saying hello from afar, and a lot of other restrictions in terms of the food that could be consumed. So it was a time of intense worry. So I kept afloat. I wanted to know more and more what was happening. I wanted to make sure that my friends were okay, that my family was okay. And so suddenly I found myself dipping deeper, going deeper and deeper into the subject. And as I said, because it was covered so intensively, you had an amount of information that was incredible. At the university where I was teaching, the University of the Veteran, there were lots of conferences on the subject, and I would attend those conferences. I would talk to people in the media, in the medical profession, in the media as well. And this is how I gathered more and more information. And then I went to teach at Rutgers University for a few months. And there again, there were lots of conferences, lots of, the topic was very, very important.
Yeah.
That's how I proceeded from my knowledge of West Africa and from all the information I could gather.
Yeah, yeah. I'm also, that's really helpful context. I'm also curious to know about the kind of form that this novel has taken, right? It begins with the beginning, an imagined beginning of the epidemic itself, and it closes with the end of the epidemic. Between these two bookends, it's a very intense sequence of narratives. If I can borrow from the poet Robert Hayden out of context here, you take us through voyages through life to death, and then voyages through death to life. It's a powerful set of voices that you feature, as Sarah alluded to earlier, from a whole variety of perspectives: members of the medical profession, patients, Ebola orphans, a dying mother, a bat, a baobab tree. The Ebola virus itself is given voice. And I'm wondering how you came to assemble this narrative as a collation of different perspectives, a book that holds voices of humans and non-humans alike.
First, I did not immediately think that I would write a book on the epidemic. It's just that after this intense immersion in the subject, and the moment the epidemic was officially contained, I realized that there was a kind of blanket silence on the whole subject. It almost became a taboo subject, something people didn't want to talk about because of the suffering and the stigma that it caused. And it puzzled me a lot, and I was wondering why. And what was concerning me was the fact that it was not possible to have lived through something so traumatic and then not, in a way, talk about it, discuss it, think about it again. But once I'd come to that conclusion, then came the burning issue of how do you approach a subject like that. And it was thanks to the fact that I have been raised in West Africa, and that the African oral tradition is so prominent and so alive still, that I came to adopt this way of telling the story, the fictional story of what happened in those three countries.
Yeah, I'm struck by that. The question of oral storytelling and the sort of sequence of testimonies, if you will, narratives of these different cast of characters, experience of the epidemic. There's something that happens when you put these narratives beside each other. There's a kind of narrative alchemy that seems to happen, where one story is changed retrospectively by the next story that comes, and it occurs to me that it takes a lot of work to do, to sort of structure that, but also a lot of trust of your reader. You know, when you're kind of offering this up, there's not that much editorializing, as in fact, there's no editorializing as we move from one narrative to the other, right? It feels unmediated, and yet you're, as I mentioned earlier, sort of collating this. Yeah, I'm struck by the kind of the work that comes out of that sort of stacking or sequencing multiple narratives, different ages, different sexes, different relationships to the economy, to nature itself. All of these things seem to sort of intensively build. Can you talk about what you imagine, what you hope for your readers as you hand them this kind of a narrative?
Well, I do trust my readers in the sense that I'd like to interact with them. And for example, sometimes I imagine that they would write more of those portraits, because if they're interested in the subject, they can now go and do their own research and maybe come up with portraits that have not appeared in the book, because there were so many people involved in the fight against the disease that it would have been impossible to make the portraits of all of them. But I think that at the end of the day, I chose these particular characters because they touched something in me personally that I thought was incredible. And for example, the discovery that there was the need for chlorine sprayer. There has been someone who has to come and spread chlorine wherever the medical teams went, or whenever they entered a house that had been contaminated by a sick person. It never occurred to me that such a person would exist, but yet that person having such an unglamorous role was absolutely essential to the survival of the team. And so it triggered something in me. And also, for example, the old the grandmother who takes care of an orphan child who has lost his parents due to the epidemic. I think that is something so beautiful that she now takes care of this child and makes sure that he goes through his trauma and will be able to live a normal life. There were so many examples of resilience and hope that I was very interested in telling that story. The two story, the story of suffering and hardship and chaos, utter chaos, and at the same time, the story of people rising to the challenge. Because you always wonder, how do people rise to such a challenge? How can someone leave their country, for example, in the West, and go all the way to Guinea or Liberia or Sierra Leone and start putting himself or herself in danger just to defeat the disease. So there is something extremely beautiful, and it has to be said again and again that we can rise to really big heights when we have that feeling of solidarity and when we want to collaborate and work together. So that I thought that was very important to tell that again.
Yeah, and right, the kind of integration, the sort of interweaving of both the pain, the sort of awesome challenge and difficulty of the experience itself, as well as how people responded to it with courage and solidarity. That makes a lot of sense. I wanted to just circle back to the point that you were making earlier about a kind of blanket silence and taboo in the aftermath of this epidemic. It occurs to me that you know, across this narrative, in the company of men, you play with a tension between a compulsion, a real need to forget the traumatic experiences that one encounters, the losses that one sustains, how close it is, how sort of all-encompassing it is. And so the tool of forgetting seems to be really important to some of the figures, whether voluntary or not. I'm thinking in particular, you raised the grandmother who takes in an orphan, but there's a young boy who struggles to distance himself from the trauma of losing his parents. So there's that, and then there's the need to remember the past itself, to hold it in mind, that is repeatedly underscored, both as an explicit point in the text, but also by virtue of having this book. In other words, to remind us, to ask us to remember, to revisit this this era of the epidemic. Can you talk a bit about how you wrestle with the tension between forgetting and remembering, but also the you know, both the value of forgetting and the danger of forgetting?
I think we do that all the time as human beings, as people. We make choices about what we want to forget and what we want to remember. But sometimes we are taken aback by what happens in our heads, because we cannot always control our memory or control our, yeah, it's impossible. Therefore, I think that is always dangerous when we don't process whatever was hard in our past, what was difficult in our past, because our legacy is always made of good moments and not good moments. That means sometimes very hard moments. But how do you process this if you can't just try to obliterate the bad periods in your life, hoping that you never think about them again? I think it's better to process this so that you are more prepared for the future in case something similar happens. But it must be a process of remembering that is going to help you progress, to help you advance. I think that's the thing about memory, is that if you cannot process it, then it holds you back. Whereas if you are able to kind of dissect it and try and understand it, maybe you can be stronger and go forward a bit more easily. That's what I thought literature could help with, in the sense that then you're not talking about just pure data. You're just talking about the way human beings react to a threat, the threat of survival. And I thought literature would help with that. And so because it came from the environment, the African environment, the African setting, I thought that it would be good to use a form that is immediately recognizable, not only in Africa, but also in the rest of the world. Because folk tales, fables are present in every culture. And I can think of many examples of those tales being foundation tales or being tales that have been told from generation to generation. So it's a known form, and it's a form that it's a genre that can be understood by everybody at one point or another. Ancient stories have fed us from our childhood to when we grow up. And we grow up with so many stories, and I think that's something that's totally universal, this genre.
Yeah. Well, it's a form that you return to repeatedly, powerfully as well. Queen Pokou is one such instance where you return to the foundational narrative of the Baoulé people, and then you sort of again with multiple perspectives, different takes, begin to interrogate the foundational narrative itself. So it's lovely to see how this form carries over across different texts with very different subject matters, right?
It's maybe because, in fact, I'm not keen on the linear structure. I like to look at different perspectives, and I think that when you hear many voices, you then can make an informed decision. You have enough, information to be able to make up your mind. I'm always worried about the people who have a tunnel vision and who can only see one part of the story, if you want, because then you can't talk to people like that because there's no common ground. And I think that we see that in our life all the time, that the divisions very often are due to the fact that we're all looking in different directions and there's nowhere where we're meeting. And am I listening to you? No. Am I talking at you? And why don't you listen? And then maybe your perspective will grow. I think that is at the individual level, but at the collective level as well. I think we need to remember that there's the need to join somewhere.
Yeah.
If we want to continue to live together, of course.
Right.
Unfortunately, some people decide to not live together anymore, but I think that's terrible. That's the extreme that can happen. I think that what we want is to be able to cohabit and do things together. So as a human species, we have to extend that to the non-humans. That means we have to extend that to the respect of the environment and the respect of those who live in this environment.
Yes, you know, there's so much I want to talk with you about regarding the sort of ecological focus of this narrative. I will say, just in response to what you were saying, that there's a way that this book, along with several others of your books, they strike me as sort of anti-didactic, in the sense that that there is no one lesson that they're offering. There's no one single message that they're sort of like laying down, but they're forcing us. The multiplicity of the narratives that you offer, they force us to confront sometimes intersections, collisions between the different stories, and sometimes divergences, and then wrestle with them, right? What we do with that. I will say that there is one voice that comes with a kind of authority. It is not the only voice, but it holds a bit more weight, if you will, and that's the baobab tree that arrives at the beginning and at the end of the tale as well. I believe you are you willing to read a bit that of the baobab tree? Yeah.
Yes,
would you share?
Yes, I want to point out that in contemporary fables or ancient fables, animals do talk, and nature also talks.
Yes.
So that's where I got the idea of a tree being the main witness of the epidemic, because trees, and especially baobab trees, can be centuries old. So this is the idea, that there is this kind of presence that is ancient and is able to have enough distance and memory of life to be kind of empathetic witness. So I will read a little bit about the baobab. So it's the baobab talking. All of a sudden, an Ebola epidemic broke out and spread through the region, becoming the most devastating outbreak ever recorded in the history of the virus. And for the first time ever, the virus even traveled all the way to the capital. It takes 5 to 21 days for the fever to appear in its acute and life-threatening form. Simply touching another person is enough for someone to become infected. This plague is worse than war. A mother, a father, a son can become a mortal enemy. Pity is the death sentence. I saw the devastation the epidemic wreaked upon this country, while the rest of the world did its best to stay away. Africa became the cradle of untold suffering, the place where the future of all mankind was at stake. Should the virus jump on a bus, a train, an airplane, it threatened human extinction. It could cross borders, travel on boats. It might hide in the tears of a child, in a lover's kiss, or in a mother's embrace. It reduced human beings to nothing but flesh and viscosity. The very pavement was strewn with anonymous ravaged corpses, the bodies of men and women who simply collapsed as though violently struck down on one of the capital's crowded streets. How can one ever forget the raging fury spreading at unimaginable speed and wiping out everything in its path? But I saw courage too. There were men, women, and young people caught up in this human tragedy, determined to fight for their own survival and that of others. I myself saw people who did not think twice about offering help. I saw people arriving from all over the world, volunteers working for free to combat the disease. In spite of the chaos, dawn continued to break, and sunset still heralded the onset of night. I saw the morning come, quivering with impatience. Once bitterness and sorrow had passed, kindness returned. Gradually, I started listening again to what humans had to say. I listened to all of them. My branches spread out and took on tremendous magnitude. Nothing that makes human beings what they are escaped me. I want to tell their stories, to lend a voice to all of those who manage to rise above fear. Ordinary men and women doing extraordinary things, no matter where they are. I want to honor their bravery. The life of humans is a story we haven't yet finished telling, a story of shipwrecked sailors washed up on an island in the middle of the sea.
Wow. What a remarkable passage to read. It does, I find it very moving. I also find that you are, you're touching on the central paradox of the Ebola epidemic, also of the COVID pandemic, which is the desire to care for your loved one is the very thing that can place them in danger and ultimately risks their life. The flip side of that is that social distancing, which which humans are not accustomed to, is the way that we're asked to show sort of compassion and care. It forces us into all of these weird sort of social contortions in order to find our way out of the epidemic itself. Thank you for that amazing passage. I want to let the audience members know that we'll be switching to Q&A in a few minutes. If you have any questions for Véronique Tadjo, please go ahead and place your questions in the Q&A, and I'll read them. I have a few more questions, if you don't mind, to pose to you. In part because the work that the Baobab does as a witness, telling the story of ordinary men and women doing extraordinary things. The witness strikes me as a long-standing presence in your work. What draws you to that figure in this particular book, In the Company of Men, and the need to record the story, if you will?
Well, I think that we need witnesses all the time. I mean, if you go to a trial, you will have the judge will ask all the people who had witnessed the problem, the issue, to come up and then explain what they know. And it's very important, and that's why you might have so many witnesses, one after the other, because you, as I was saying earlier, you cannot tell a story in a linear way. If you want to understand what happened exactly, you need to hear it from different point of views, from different people who have been involved in the particular issue you're trying to understand. And that's why witnesses are so important, because they each come with their own perspective, their subjectivities as well. And sometimes you have, for example, it is known that sometimes you have witnesses that you can trust and witnesses that are absolutely unreliable. But that's why you need to hear many voices. I find that extremely important. I think witnesses have give us an option of understanding different perspectives, because we only have our own perspective, and so we're very limited in our understanding of a lot of issues. That's why you need other people who have been there to tell us what happened exactly. And from their own perspective, that's why you have the mother, that's why you have the medical doctor, that's why you have the young man who is a student but becomes a chlorine sprayer. That's why you have the grave diggers, that's why you have the nurse, that's why they all are living the epidemic, but through their own experience, their own lived experience. And that's what is very enriching. But I wanted to say one little thing about witnessing, is that because of the media, because of television, because of newspapers, we have, in a sense, become indirect witnesses of the many sometimes disaster unfolding in the world. I mean, I carry the war in Syria in me from reading and watching the television and being informed every day. I cannot say I do not know anymore. I also witnessed what's happening in Hong Kong, and all the fight for freedom that's going on. So we have also, whether we want it or not, become we witness what some of the dramas of the world.
Yeah, and witnessing, the witness forces a confrontation as well, right? With what one doesn't know or what one prefers not to acknowledge. And I think that part of the work that the Baobab does is, along with the bat and certainly the Ebola virus, right? The non-human speakers.
Yes.
Remind us, I mean, as humans, as a species, as a component of the sort of ecological system, we don't come off well in this book, right? In other words, when the Baobab says early on in the book, you cannot destroy the forest without spilling blood. It's a powerful sentence to me, because on the one hand, it's a beautiful metaphorical sentence to think about the destruction of forests in relation to the substance of life, right? But in the context of this book that is about the Ebola virus, you're talking also about a hemorrhagic fever, right? About the actual spilling of blood. And you are asking us, or the Baobab is asking us to draw a straight line between epidemics and ecological destruction. It's a powerful moment.
Yes. Maybe because people have a tendency to kind of not join the dots. That means you put epidemics on one side, climate change on the other side, degradation of the environment on another side, And then, sometimes you forget to see that all these issues are connected, and that the deforestation will bring closer contact with wild animals, and but also sometimes you can see that it's also going to change the weather patterns in a country that loses about 70% of its forest coverage. So we have to be responsible for our actions, understand the consequences of our actions, and not say, why do we have natural disasters, or why do we have this, or why do we have epidemics, more and more epidemics, without trying to join the dots, as I tried to say. That's why I wanted to really set the background of the environmental destruction in a way, so that we understand where all this is coming from. That it's not just an act of God. It's not just something that was not expected. In fact, people who were interested in environmental, the future of the planet, were very aware that a new epidemic was going to come, or even a pandemic. So only people who didn't want to see the connection were surprised by what happened.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so the natural world is, sort of on different spectrums of critique, if you will, of humanity, right? Is asking or rejecting the way that humanity as a whole has operated, and yet, as I hope is clear from what we've been talking about to our viewers, there is a great deal of sympathy that this novel delves into, looking at courage, as you mentioned, acts in spite of fear, survivor's guilt, moments of grief and despair as well. There's a lot of sympathy here. How do you balance, for the human readers, how do you balance the work of critique that is very clear in this novel and the work of sympathy, which I think is equally clear?
I suppose it comes from a genuine love for humanity, the belief that we have it in ourselves to change our life for the better, and that this is always going to be a possibility, and that we have choices, and that sometimes we make the wrong choices, but that sometimes we can also redress the balance. And it's true, I love life, and I love people, and I think that I try to pass that on in the book. In that sense, yes, in that sense, Baobab was a character that was very easy to imagine.
Great. I want to turn briefly or quickly to some of the viewers' questions, and so I'll start with the first one from an anonymous attendee regarding the 4-year gap between the book's original publication and this year's translation. Does the book feel years later and in a different language like the same story you first put down?
Yes, that's the story. Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's the power of translation. I think translation takes you somewhere else in a sense, and helps you to revisit the original text it's very striking how you then discover some of the aspects in the original text that you had not really paid sometimes much attention to. Yes, it's a kind of eye-opening. As a writer, you see, if you involve in the translation, as a writer, you see your weaknesses and your strength, and you see, oh, here is something that maybe I could in a way say it differently in the translation without jumping to something totally different, but just seeing it with new eyes, or in a sense. Then I think that's the beauty of translation, is that it gives you almost another chance of telling the story, but to a new audience. And again, it's a question of adapting that story to that new audience.
Just a quick follow-up. Did you find yourself in need of making adjustments given the new audience?
Not too much. No, it was more like it seemed that certain terms, for example, were more appropriate to the current situation, and that they would be easily picked up because of what we were experiencing at the moment. But because I know English-speaking West Africa and French-speaking West Africa, it wasn't too difficult to find the equivalent terms. It was more a question of in the COVID era, there's some words that go straight to the understanding of what people are experiencing at the moment.
Right. The context.
Mm-hmm.
We have a reader, a viewer, Susan, who asks, why did you select this book's title?
Oh, In the Company of Man? Why? Because in fact, it's from the point of view of non-humans. That means men are suddenly within nature, not above nature. And then the rest of the planet, if you want, is kind of watching what human beings are doing, and even giving an opinion on their action. So it's trying to say that we are, in a way, we are on the same level. We are animals after all. We are mammals, and we should remember that. And we should remember our dependency to the rest of the universe and to the rest of the planet and those who inhabit it.
I think part of the destruction is the refusal to recognize our relationship to the natural world and humans as animals themselves. Yes. And it redounds violently onto the animals, the natural world itself. It redounds also because we are part of that natural world. Very violently onto us in the form of a virus, for example, right? There is that interrelation that you're talking about. Another anonymous attendee would like to know what it was like to write from the perspective of the virus itself.
Yes, it was an interesting perspective, but I didn't want to make it the villain. And the complete villain of the story, right. Because I think that, as I said earlier, human beings are not virtuous. It's not an act of God. It's not something. In fact, viruses are not our enemies, because we need them to have a balance in life. They have all sorts of functions that are necessary for the equilibrium of life on Earth. So we have to understand that again, everything is connected, and then what I liked about the voice of the virus is that it allowed me to tell a few truths, because I think human beings need to hear a few truths.
Indeed, indeed. There's another viewer, Evie, would like to know, I'm curious how Véronique did the research needed for this novel, and also what the emotional experience of the writing was, traumatizing or something else?
I think it was both traumatizing and liberating in some ways, because I had the feeling that some silence, maybe somewhere unhealthy silence had been broken, and that maybe we could start a conversation, and we could start talking about this huge trauma that has left a big stigma on the whole of Africa, you can say, or the West African region. But I wanted also, it was liberating in the sense that with time I realized that there was no point putting a nationality on something like an epidemic, that viruses knew no borders, and that today, whether it has happened, it has started the pandemic has started in China, is irrelevant. It's now the whole world that has to work together.
Great. Another viewer would like to know, are there ongoing discussions in Africa as to the past, current, and future pandemics brought about by outside governments and invested local politicians who look to profit from land expansion?
I think that people on the continent are becoming more and more aware of the consequences of the destruction of nature, and this is good news, because a lot of voices are coming up, and you have a lot of, for example, trials in Gabon or in other countries where big companies, oil companies in particular, are taken to court over their damaging of the environment. And so this is a consciousness that's growing in terms of also the living conditions in cities. And this is all good news. It's very good news.
Great, great.
We have time for one more quick question.
Okay, all right. Let me read something from Meda. Bonjour, Véronique. Just wanted to thank you for your wonderful presentation of the book. We have fond memories of your visiting Rutgers University and discussing your poetry in our class. We read an extract from your book in my French class for French for healthcare class. And I totally agree with your idea that literature and art help us understand a health crisis much better than just scientific data. And in fact, we were just talking about how abstract the loss of 500,000 people in the United States feels. But a book with 15 particular narratives seems holdable, it seems imaginable, and processable, if you will, makes it much less abstract, and holds us to the details and the specificities of life as well as death.
Yes, thank you. I was hoping that would be what comes out of the book. And that's what I was trying to do, apart from the numbers, which sometimes we can't understand, or even the type of experience that people have lived. It's important to make it a bit more real, to give the readers the possibility of identifying with the events.
Thank you again. I'm sorry to cut us off here. We are past 6 o'clock. So thank you again to Véronique and Stéphane for their time, particularly discussing this incredibly relevant topic. And thank you all for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you'd like to support Véronique and the bookstore, please click the link in the chat to purchase In the Company of Men. We sincerely appreciate your support. Thank you so much and have a great evening, everyone.
Right. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
Thank you, Stéphane.
Thank you, Véronique. Thank you, Sarah. It was a delight.
Thank you.
And good luck.